Hello again. Okay, this is the second part of the podcast in which I'm walking and talking through the key features of German industry from 1914 to 1939. You're looking at exactly the same document as the first podcast. I'm just going to, although you won't see the annotations and highlighting, it has to be a brand new document for this podcast. So what I'll do is I'll just scroll down straight to where we left off. So we were talking about the post World War I recovery, and key features that are highlighted there was effectively export oriented industry did well, and the huge investment from America, which could be visibly seen in the way in which German industry worked, in particular labour-saving production techniques, etc. And as a result, that had a significant impact. The German government also must take credit for some of the recovery. The Rentenmark in particular, the intervention of Stresemann, you remember that from GCSE, had a positive impact as well. However, okay, and there's obviously a huge however on this, and we clearly have the advantage of hindsight. From the perspective of German people, let's take the year 1927-28. By the middle of the 1920s, we often talk about a golden era. It really seemed that Germany had made a remarkable industrial recovery from the shock of defeat of 1918. Which was true, but that recovery was a house of cards because it was propped up by foreign money, in particular from America. And as I say, it was a heavily distorted recovery because the recovery was on one particular sector of industry, the manufacturing industry. Other sectors of industry, in particular primary industry, mining, etc., and agriculture, did not recover at the same rate. And in particular, that dependency on American loans made the country very, very vulnerable. Now, that vulnerability can be seen by looking at two significant economic problems that Germany experienced in the 1920s. The first one was the hyperinflation of 1923. Now, that deficit financing, remember, spending money that basically she didn't have, effectively borrowing off the German people by selling war bonds, caused that inflation that turned into a hyperinflation in 1923. So you got the decline in the value of the currency because there was a shortage of the currency, which led to an inflation 1922. But what turned it into a hyperinflation, where prices simply went so high that currency just lost its value completely, of course, was the fact that Germany defaulted on reparations payments in the end of 1922, and then in January 1923, because Germany was no longer paying reparations to France and Belgium, effectively those two countries recommenced World War I. I mean, putting it quite simply, they invaded Germany. Okay, so the invasion that never happened during World War I actually did happen in 1923, and they occupied Germany's key industrial area, which is part of the Rhineland to the north, called the Ruhr. And the German policy of passive resistance, of effectively refusing to cooperate with invaders, so workers putting their tools down, refusing to run the factories, effectively led production to stop. The French and the Belgian troops ran the factories themselves. They seized the goods of those factories, so they took reparations in kind rather than in cash, and effectively the German government printed money to pay those striking workers, which was a mistake with hindsight, and with so much currency then floating around, effectively the inflation turned into a hyperinflation. Now, what was the key impact of that? Okay, well, the key impact was on the middle classes, because middle classes, more than any other social group, put money aside for a rainy day. Okay, they have savings, and when you have savings put to one side, then effectively, if you have an inflation, those savings lose value. So let's say you have saved 10,000 marks over 5 years of hard savings. Suddenly, those 10,000 marks won't even buy a loaf of bread. So it had a huge impact on the middle classes. And that seriously damaged the trust in the German government. Now that trust, of course, had already been damaged. Remember how in 1919 there was a huge confidence in the new system, in the new government. In the first 6 months of 1919, 76% of the population voted for pro-Republican parties, but then it was damaged by the Treaty of Versailles and the stab in the back myth and the myth of the November criminals. And now what the hyperinflation did is it added fuel to that fire, and it just reaffirmed for many of the middle classes that the new republic was not working in their interests. Okay, now a key feature of the hyperinflation of 1923 was effectively low. Okay, you've got to think of low and high. The hyperinflation was low unemployment. Low unemployment. Most Germans had jobs in 1923. What was going up were prices. Now, we then moved to 1929. Of course, in the middle of the 1920s, you've got an apparent recovery. You know, the Rentenmark and the Dawes Plan kicked in, and so it seemed as if the crisis of 1923 had moved away. But then, of course, we have the stock market crash in America, the Wall Street crash, which started the Great Depression. That ran through into the middle of the 1930s. It carried on after Hitler had become Chancellor in January 1933. Now again, the key thing here is, again, think about the downward and upward arrows, but it's completely the opposite of the hyperinflation. Whereas with the hyperinflation, effectively you had high prices going up. What happened with the Great Depression is prices were going down, okay? So it was completely the opposite. And whereas with hyperinflation, you had low unemployment, in the Great Depression, unemployment is going up. So completely the opposite. The crisis of 1923 was an inflation. The economy was expanding too fast, whereas the crisis of 1929, that began in 1929, was a depression. The economy was becoming depressed. Okay, and again, the key impact on that, there was a huge impact on the middle classes, because what it basically did is it destroyed many middle class businesses, the Great Depression. Okay, because it hit in particular industry. Because why was that? Because unlike, the Great Depression hit all countries across the whole world, but it hit Germany particularly badly. Why? Because of Germany's extremely high rates of industrialization in the 1920s. And of course, it was industry that was hit by the Great Depression, businesses closing down. So Germany was hit badly, but also obviously because Germany borrowed so heavily from America. And it was that initial America pulling out her loans from any country that she'd borrowed from, that she'd lent money to. Well, because America had lent so much money to Germany, and America lent money to lots of countries, but particularly to Germany, Germany was especially badly hit. So I suppose the key thing to think about there, the linking factor, is the damage to the middle classes. Okay, both the hyperinflation of 23 and the Great Depression of 1929 that carried through into the middle of the 1930s in particular hit the middle classes. Now, why is that relevant? Well, moving on, the final section, the economic recovery under the Nazis in the 1930s. We'll obviously look more at this when we start the depth study, but a key feature is that Hitler and the Nazi power and the Nazi Party, they came to power. Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933 on the back of 4 years or 3.5 years of economic misery, the Great Depression. And the Nazi Party's support, the popularity of the Nazi Party, and when Hitler came to power, they had 33% of the vote, was to a large part drawn from the middle classes who who had been particularly badly hit by the Great Depression with their businesses going under, who had lost, whose confidence in the Republic had been damaged in 1923 by the hyperinflation, and whose hopes had initially been high for the Republic back in 1919, but had been, of course, damaged. They had, in particular, been susceptible to the stab in the back myth following the Treaty of Versailles. So the Nazi Party, they were a catch-all party that drew support from many social classes, but in particular they drew support from the disillusioned middle classes who had lost confidence in the Republic. So, in terms of the economy, where does this leave it? Where does this leave us? What are the sort of key points that we need to know about the economy? Well, I suppose the overarching point is that recovery was a key feature. Okay, that Hitler came to power in January 1933. The German economy by 1939 had recovered in many, many ways. Okay, now it's a complex picture, but this is a breadth study, it's not a depth study. As I said in the lesson, this could be a whole year's topic, the German economy. But if I'm going to sort of highlight key features, I'm just going to point out the following 5. Okay, number 1, government intervention was a key feature. Okay, Hitler continued effectively with the policy that the German government used during World War One, and that's an important link to make. Okay, because in Hitler's mind, he was preparing for war, and when that war arrives, Hitler does not want the German economy to struggle the way it had in World War One. Now, Hitler approved basically of the centralisation of industry, the way the government had taken control over the economy in World War One, and so effectively he put the economy on a war footing straight away in 1933. Germany wasn't at war yet, but he ran the economy as if Germany was at war. So government intervention was a key thing. Now, obviously, he needed to reboost the economy to prepare for war. So the first feature of government intervention was a lot of work creation schemes. And effectively, they were funded in a similar way to World War One. And now, they weren't called war bonds. They were funded by what were called MIFO bills. But effectively, Hitler was spending money that he didn't actually have. But that didn't particularly worry him, because in his view, he's preparing for war, and this is what we call a plunder economy. When effectively the war would start, it didn't matter if the German government was in debt, he would pay off those debts by plundering the countries that Germany conquered. Okay, so the first feature is government intervention. The second feature, which isn't in the notes here, very, very important one, but it's similar to that point I made about World War One. This was not a socialist economy that Hitler set up. It was what he basically did. It was a capitalist economy. Hitler deeply admired the profit incentive, that if you own your own business, that you should be able to make yourself rich. So Hitler harnessed the energy of capitalism, in a sense, the greed of big business, and harnessed it to the state. So effectively, he gave direction to German business. If you continue to work with the state, as you have done since the days of the Kaiser, bear in mind Sammlungspolitik, politic, the industrialists had harnessed themselves to the state even before World War One, that you continue to do that under the Nazi regime, you will basically profit as long as you harness your industry to the political objectives of the regime, which basically was preparing for war. So the message was, if you make weapons, you will become rich. So that's the second feature. The third feature was obviously rearmament, which basically meant that if you're going to rearm, a huge focus on heavy industry. And as I've said in the lesson yesterday, there's an irony there, because the key people who backed Hitler into power were small businessmen, and they did not prosper in the Third Reich under Hitler. If you're going to prepare for war, tanks are not made by little village craft shops. Artisans will not make big weapons. Okay, they may be businessmen, but effectively it is the cities that will benefit. It is the cities that will that need to expand. Industry, big industry, needed to expand, and there's a big contradiction there, and we'll talk, and that's relevant to the topic on agriculture. Because Nazi propaganda had always emphasised the small man, the small farmers, they were the best Germans, etc. But actually, from 1933, Hitler struggled with a contradiction there. To prepare for war, and to prepare for war to benefit the small man, he had to basically develop big business. So small businesses went under. So that's the third feature. The focus on heavy industry. The fourth feature, and again there's a synoptic link with World War One, was the huge emphasis on ersatz materials, synthetics. If Germany is going to be survive with a huge war, the issue that she can't afford to be blockaded as had happened in 1914 to 18. And so therefore, right from 1933, Hitler gave a huge emphasis on ersatz material as part of preparing for self-sufficiency, or in German, autarky, so that she wasn't dependent on foreign goods being bought in, because if there was a British blockade in a future war, then Germany would find itself in the same situation as happened in 1914 to 1918. Now, the ersatz materials in particular became a focus of what we call the 4-year plan that was launched in 1936 by the Nazi called Hermann Goering. Okay, so that was the key feature there. And the fifth feature was the plunder economy that I alluded to a couple of minutes ago. A key feature of the way Hitler ran the economy, in a sense, he didn't follow conventional economics. Conventional governments will only spend as much as they have. Hitler wasn't interested in that. He deliberately overspent because he knew that it's preparing for war. War would lead to conquest, and with conquest you can loot the economies of the conquered countries, and you can basically pay off your debts and deal with your deficit, deal with your overdraft, your government overdraft, in that way. That's it. I'll finish there. I will do a second podcast on agriculture, but I'll produce that in the next 24 hours and put that up to YouTube as well. Hopefully that was useful for you. Thank you.